next discussion is titled War of Words, Disinformation, Propaganda, and Negotiations. I think it's been fair to say, and I think many have noted, that while Russia and Putin have not done very well militarily, if you recall that when they went on the march against Kyiv, some of them brought their dress uniforms because they thought that they were going to have a victory parade down Khreshchatyk. And of course, we know that didn't happen. But to quote General Breedlove, when he teaches about war, he says he uses the acronym DIME, several dimensions. There's diplomacy, information, military, and economics. I think it's easy to say and fair to say that on the information front, he is definitely winning. So I'm very pleased to have with us two extraordinary young women that I am just happy to meet, who have been studying these issues and can really educate us, because I think there is a great need to be educated about the differences between disinformation, propaganda, and then also how that plays into negotiations, which of course everybody is talking about now. We have with us Yulia Osmolovska. She is director of GLOBSEC Kyiv office and a member of the Civil Council of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. As director of GLOBSEC, she's responsible for the strategic management and development of policy initiatives that are related to modern warfare and the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine. Dr. Ivana Stradner is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy and senior lecturer at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Stradner specializes in Russian military strategy and information operations. Her research focuses on the psychological and technical aspects of Russian information security. I'm so delighted they're here with us because they've done research on this topic, so it isn't some of us who are just surmising things because of some cursory observation of what's going on. So I think we have a wonderful opportunity to really understand all that is going on based on some very timely research that both of them have been doing. I think we're going to begin with Yulia, if I recall. That's what okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me start with commenting of what Pani Nadia had been saying. So it's definitely, you made a gloomy assessment that Russia is definitely winning information war. And this is something that hasn't been constant. I mean, when the full-scale invasion started, we, as I call us, responsible expert community, working together with the government, aligned our efforts and started to do everything we can using our contacts. Me, myself, I did two postings in the embassy in London. So I just called my friend from the media in the UK and asked to provide me with all the mobile numbers of all the editors of chief main media. And we started to compile every day a brief summary of what's going on, and just been spreading it through our contacts and among politicians as well. And this is how this kind of voluntary movement of responsible expert community got combined. And we every day been sharing like 4 to 5 different analytical papers produced by different institutions. And then it was to my delight when I was in the UK myself, doing public speeches already in March about what's happening in Ukraine, and then later on in May. One of the best assessments that we heard that Ukraine is definitely winning information war, because the world had been in the know what's going on about all these Russian brutalities and so on. So we understood that our efforts had been not got in vain. So we definitely had been successful in that. And right now, I could agree with you that we are probably losing this momentum, and it's not because of the government is not working well, the responsible expert community is not working well, or our Ukrainian diaspora, people like you, people like the ambassador, and all our partners are not working well or lose the enthusiasm. Not, we haven't. But the point is that Russians' narratives started to pay their wave to the minds and hearts internationally. And also there is a phenomenon, obvious, absolutely obvious, it had been predictable, a sort of a fatigue, or something like what we call in psychology, we're getting used to an irritator. So basically, if every day we keep talking or listening about the wars going on, or some murders and so on. So people just psychologically get used to it. So we definitely could say that we could see three distinctive phases of Russia propaganda working in Ukraine. Something that happened before 2014, in between 2014 and 2022, and after the full-scale invasion started 2022 onwards. Plus, I would probably add the new dimension of this Russian propaganda, which started to happen with the elections and the new presidential team in the US. Because right now, for instance, just a small example, the rhetorics that Russians had been using before, it's like we are fighting this religious war against a capitalist West, where US is the leader of that very adversary camp. Right now, we can distinguish the difference of the narratives the Russians are using against Europe, like very hostile, very warmonger-oriented community, whereas the US is definitely sounds more reasonable, and we would like to talk to them because they could possibly listen to us and understand our viewpoint and so on. So before 2014, it had not been like a very hostile messaging about Ukraine. It had been more like a sort of a win-win, friendly relations, brotherly relations, and so on. So they hadn't been very hostile, and also the issue of Crimea belonging to Russia as pure Russian territory also had not been on the agenda. It was very interesting. Then, because probably, yes, there is a linkage with the Revolution of Dignity, Russians decided that they are losing the country and they need to do something. So definitely, and it was a turning point in their propaganda. They started to talk about this, during this hybrid war, they started to talk about the rights of some regions for self-determination and the suppression of Russian ethnic minority and so on. So this style of language has become more hostile, but it was still a propaganda. So here I think that it's important to make the difference of propaganda and disinformation, and why propaganda is not working any longer in Ukraine. It's about disinformation at the moment. So propaganda is mostly something ideologically centered, that you have the ideology and a number of different tools to support and pursue this course. So basically it was about the Soviet model at the beginning, and then when we got independence, it was about Ruski Mir model. Something that part of Ukrainian population actually tended to believe in and had been very comfortable with this kind of thinking, without seeing this all this brutal stuff that revealed itself after the full-scale invasion especially. Disinformation is rather about not pursuing a particular ideology course, but rather to overwhelm you with different conflicting messages in order for you to be fed up with all this different information and to switch off your rational mind to do this objective analysis of what's going on. And the psychological effect of this disinformation, overwhelming of information, is information toxicity, which could lead to a sort of like either self-isolation, so a person doesn't want to listen to anything of this type or to process this information, or they're getting more agitated, aggressively agitated against something. So this is something which is happening in Ukraine right now. Propaganda no longer is working about this ideology, about Ruski Mir and so on, had been effectively cracked by Russians themselves since the full-scale invasion and all the atrocities that we saw in Bucha. So when you see something like that, when you experience all this type of stuff, like they say that they into ceasefire because Putin instructed all the drones to stop flying over Ukraine's territory. He promised this to Trump over the telephone conversation, and it had been fixed in official statement from Kremlin. And the next few minutes, you just literally hear air alert, and you keep commenting to international media on the background of, and on the background people could hear actually this sound of drones flying over you and all this shooting that are happening from Ukrainian air defense. So this is why propaganda is not working. But definitely we're in on very wobbling soil at the moment in Ukraine, because if not winning kinetically, Russians are definitely will be trying to still win Ukraine or win control over Ukraine in by non-kinetic means. And that means that even when we win this war militarily, kinetically, I do support the ambassador's word of that we can win if we accumulate our efforts to support it. And be able to navigate through these very harsh realities that we have these days, but still the war won't be over. Russians would never forget and forgive this humiliation that they experienced with the very first days of war, when we literally made them laughingstock to the whole of the world. The second, how it was notoriously said, the second greatest army in the world has become the second army in Ukraine, when considered the fighting of Ukrainian armed forces and Russian armed forces. And in this fight, in this humiliation, they consider our partners from the West as part of this game. So we intrinsically linked in Russian perception, and this is why the revenge should go not just to Ukraine, but to the partners also, because they assisted us, they supported us to humiliate Russians at the beginning. So whatever happens next, they would never forgive this. And this is why they will be keeping this war, trying to destroy the society from within. And right now we're talking about the dominating narratives at this stage. So it's definitely about Ukraine being a failed state. West is extremely weak and incapable to support. America has becoming reasonably rational in their narratives, and Ukraine shouldn't be counting on America, and without America, Ukraine is bound to fail. Then Ukraine needs to change its political leadership and so on. So the issue of pressing with elections in Ukraine, this is something artificially invented by Russians, because they don't understand that when the country gets into this political cycle, so it's already very weak to fight existential threat like Russia is. Right now there is a consensus, unwritten consensus in Ukrainian society. However critical we might be about President Zelensky, we are not talking on these issues right now, because we do understand that there is existential threat that requires the consolidation of the society, and we are ready to go on to keep it. We're not into these elections, but this is something which is in Russia's interest. So to finish with that, there is very good formula introduced by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Pavlo Klimkin, on our visit here these days right now. So if the new administration rather understands the terms sovereignty, so let's frame Ukraine's case in terms of 4 building blocks of this sovereignty: defense and security sovereignty, sovereignty in foreign policy definition, so we will define whom we are aligning with. Sovereignty of internal policy, we will define who will be the president in our country. And the sovereignty of the territory. So definitely non-recognition to any illegal stuff that Russians are doing in Ukraine right now. And if we are aligned, at least with this perception, and it's possible to get aligned with this perception with the current administration, I really hope it, so we definitely are bound to win. Thank you.
Ivana's going to discuss a bit about how Moscow perceives information operations and how the Russian military and intelligence agencies operate in this field.
So I'll start actually with this question, who will win this war? I'll tell you what the Russian military believes. They believe who has information superiority that is going to win this war. And I heard today multiple times mentioning President Reagan. And I couldn't agree more, because President Reagan absolutely understood very, very well the power of information superiority. And all our families who lived in Eastern Europe understands very, very well the power of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other powerful tools related to soft power. But today I would like to actually tell you a little bit more why we should not talk about Russian influence operations and some random propaganda, random information warfare. No, 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 no. Information is a weapon for the Russian Ministry of Defense. So let's start with the first slide. This is from the Russian Ministry of Defense website, how they define information warfare. And you can actually really see the power of psychological operations in order to destabilize society and the government. I like to read Russian strategies, and you can actually see they openly claim that who has information superiority in terms of psychological and information operations, that will lay the groundwork for a victory. In 2017, Russia established information operations forces, and Sergei Shoigu, who was back then the Minister of Defense, openly claimed that propaganda should be smart, competent, and effective. And the Russian military values 4-to-1 non-kinetic to kinetic forces. So this really tells you all you need to know how the Russian military operates in this space. They do not need to roll on tanks and jets in any of the Western capitals. They are already accomplishing their military and security objectives without a single bullet. We like here in the West to talk about influence operations, usually around the election time, so that's usually the time when I'm most busy with interviews. So I'm very grateful, really, that you asked me to talk about this topic outside of the election cycle, because influence operations coming from Russia are 24/7, 365 days. They're not only about elections. They use every vulnerability possible to exploit. Whether to accuse the United States of, and our intelligence of training migratory birds to fly from Ukraine to Russia, and to deliver bioweapons. So my question to the Russian intelligence would be, what would be our incentive to do that? Because those migratory birds have to eventually come back. So they would eventually come back with that poison. So it makes no sense. But logic is not something that matters in this game. They love to sometimes talk about secessionist movements here in the United States, whether triggering secessionist movements in California or Texas. So it's not really anymore also about bots and trolls on social media platforms, because we have developed a lot of software tools to track those influence operations. They have adapted their influence operations. So now, for example, they use social media influencers, so everything looks like a grassroots movement. When it comes to Ukraine, one of the most powerful, there are two powerful things that are really, unfortunately, working in the West. One is when it comes to our support to Ukraine to make sure to scare people related to nuclear weapons. And I always like to really refer as a boring academic to this old theoretical concept of reflexive control. But that concept was actually, it's a cornerstone of Russian influence operations. Strategic deception is the key. What does it mean? It means how to feed your opponent with information that you think that might benefit that opponent, but actually benefits you. And they developed all those games back during the Cold War when it comes to nuclear weapons. Because for Russia, nuclear weapon is first and foremost a cognitive weapon to make sure that the West provides A, B, C, D out of fear of nuclear escalation. I can give you multiple examples since 2022, coming from the West, fearing nuclear Armageddon arsenal. And if you read the latest ODNI report that was just published a few days ago, you can also read, unfortunately, how Russian influence operations, the psychological operations, still work. Next slide, please. So this is how they operate. This is exactly how the Russian military is building a model to target Americans, specifically something that I'm working on, cognitive processes. They understand very well perception management. They understand very well how we process information here, what makes us tick, et cetera, et cetera. So the first part is the model of the American way of thinking. The second model is how the Russians are thinking. And the third model, how they launch those influence operations, are basically the combination of the two. And this is exactly how they're operating. My work in particular, today I'm talking mostly about Russian offensive operations, but mostly in the US, I work on our military and intelligence, how we should conduct offensive influence operations. So this is really nothing new. This is the only thing that is new nowadays is new technologies. So in a moment, you will see exactly how they operate. So there are a couple of instances, basically lead USA to take predetermined choices in information space that favor Moscow, how to exert influence on the adversary's actions, and how to prompt the adversary to make decisions that are to its advantage. And the ultimate goal is truly to create information superiority. I just mentioned a couple of examples. I can mention multiple more examples. In particular, one that is right now the most concerning to me is our center of gravity, which is our alliances. And that's something that Russia is working 24/7 currently to make sure that our center of gravity is collapsing. So how they're also operating, they basically create a deceptive objective and create a fake goal. So it's like a cat, like you put a laser and the cat is chasing that laser. Create a fake goal, and then they use the image transfer to influence our cognitive processes. And I know, I'm quite certain that all of us, we may laugh about those influence operations related to biological weapons. The world does not revolve around Brussels, London, or Washington, D.C. Their influence operations may also not work in Ukraine, as we heard, but Russia is doing quite a good job when it comes to the global south. And that's how they are rallying their allies in the information space. A lot of people love to talk about RT and Sputnik as the forefront of Russian influence operations, but actually Russia is expanding their influence operations. They are now creating something that is called BRICS TV, pushing more narratives related to economy and how the West is collapsing. Those influence operations are extremely important because for the Russian Ministry of Defense, information is a weapon. That's how they declare it. They also understand very well our vulnerabilities, which is it's extremely difficult to compete in information space as a democracy because we have to follow certain rules. Even during the Cold War, when we launched all those influence operations related to modern art, music, American jazz, it was in alignment with our laws. But Moscow doesn't have to build. All they have to do is to destruct and completely destroy. And it's much easier to destroy something in information space than to build. And the second point that I also want to make is that those influence operations are extremely also important to follow what is happening in the global south, because eventually that will also have the impact. And my last point that I want to make is to understand how Russia is operating in this space, we have to think like them. We do not have to act like them. We have to understand how they think like about information operations. And they genuinely believe that they value non-military to military forces 4-1, and who has information superiority can win this war. So it is definitely going to be a challenging time ahead of us. And even when Ukraine wins, make no mistake, information warfare will stay here. And I truly hope that this administration will approach this subject through peace, through informational strength. So we'll stop here.
Yulia, you have talked about, when we were talking earlier, how the Russians view negotiations. Because, of course, this is what is number one topic, right? How we're negotiating with them and how are they. So if you would just say a few words about how you see their style of negotiations, and do we understand their style of negotiations?
Let me give you a bit of prehistory why we're talking about this and psychological component of it. Having spent 15 years in diplomatic service, being participant of many top-level negotiations, sometimes I saw that psychologically, even if you're prepared and you're on the winning side, something might happen and you're just getting out of the room completely lost. So I decided to dig deeper into that, and because the Western mindset had been more or less clear for us. It's based on this theory of rational choice. So if something beneficial for you, you obviously opt for it. If it's not, so you're not. So I decided to study the Russian mindset, because the post-Soviet space is perceived by our Western partners mostly as a sort of like irrational thinking, because for our cultures and for Russia is more characteristically intangibles in negotiations, something that you can't measure physically, might matter much more. So they're ready to sustain the losses because of the sanctions, but because they are satisfied that they see that Ukraine suffers more, they're ready to sustain their personal discomfort. And this is very important to understand, that for Russians, it's what's more important. Intangibles like recognition, admission to the club, respect out of fear. This is why, when the war started, we recommended our Western partners to work with the issue of isolation. Because for Russians, for those who've been grown up in Soviet culture, this is something that they never get rid of. So we've been brought up, even my generation, in understanding of this unwritten competition with the West. And the Soviets always had been trying to present that we as the best model to live in. This is why it never gets out of the agenda. It's always been the case that we should be the best in the world. This is why when Russia is not admitted to the club of the best in the world, it's definitely very much hurting them. And we had been very much successful on that for all these 3 years, working with as isolation principle. And right now, it's just because of the different strategy applied and understanding that talking and diplomatic means could lead to the different result. Russians are just seeing this as a reward for doing nothing. And this is very dangerous way to go, but we also try to raise this understanding here. This is our mission also these days. Try to show that still you shouldn't exclude intangibles and isolation or belonging to the club as your carrot and stick policy. So it's not something that is given to Russia in advance, that you already admitted and somebody is talking to you, but something that you have to earn. If you disbehave to the commitments, then you will be deprived from that. So to put it in one sentence then, for Russians, negotiations never have been a sort of a win-win game. They never cared about the other side, how much the other side would get from it, because they had not been caring much about the sustainability of result. For Russians, negotiations is another form of fight. They consider opponent as a foe, not as a friend. And from this perception, they will be doing all the different tricks, applying them. There is certain toolbox and mixture of KGB and old school diplomacy, Soviet-style methods that they apply. We can talk about this if somebody is interested. And this is something which they're playing with. The target is to use all these means to switch your rational mind in order for you to disable you to assess and analyze rationally what's going on at the table and to be obsessed emotionally and thus making mistakes. And this is where they gain their benefits. Thank you.
So, Alina, I wanted to ask you, do you think we in the West understand the value of, that the Russians place on disinformation or propaganda?
Well, the very first fact that you invited me to this panel, it shows me that there are still a lot of people in this room who value and who understand the role of influence operations. The problem is that this threat is invisible, you cannot smell it, you cannot touch it, and that's for a lot of people who are not in this field or studying from a security perspective, they can think that we are all just conspiracy theorists.
Or paranoid.
But it's exactly the purpose of having this type of strategic deception as a powerful weapon where they can accomplish a lot of their security objectives without a single bullet. But I just also want to tell you my other concern, what we do not also understand about Russia, exactly what you said about how they perceive win-win versus zero-sum game. I want to tell you a joke that is an old Russian joke. There is a peasant, and he is surrounded by two neighbors, and his neighbors has 2 cows. And he was very upset about that because he didn't have any cow. So he asked the God if he can help him. And the God said, sure, how can I help you? Can I please also give you a cow? And he said, no, I don't want that. So what do you want? I want you to kill the cows of my neighbors. So that's an old Russian joke to understand why our perception about cooperation might not bode well in Moscow. And that's why I brought that particular reflexive control. In 1960, the guy called Lefebvre Vladimir, he modeled psychological games based on 2 different ethical systems. He had a background in mathematics and psychology. He understood very well the American ethical system, and he compared it to the Russian. Everything is out there, everything is declassified now, you can read it. So, and once you understand how they perceived the American way of thinking, nothing has changed to this date. And my last point is the only language that Putin understands is the language of power. Kindness is weakness for him. And that's unfortunately something that some negotiators might misunderstand.
Thank you.
I think you won that disinformation fight in Europe broadly, but we're really losing it in America. So knowing that Russians do not understand well America, they look to the White House, they think this is a Tsar, and you can deal with Trump like with Putin, but they're very poor to deal with Congress, with states, and so on. Do you think that we need to work very hard on the ground, go locally, go to states, speak with congressmen, speak with journalists? Because, when you have a war right now with Musk and Tuckers, this is different world. but you can still win it if you work on the ground. Do you, creatively think about working on the ground, engaging different communities, think tanks, congressmen themselves, because I think that's the way you have to do. And another thing that I think we have to do as a West, we have to launch offensive operations against Russia. We're not so good on that. We are defending against Russia in our territories. We have to be very aggressive in Russia. We still speak Russian, we understand their mentality, we understand how stupid sometimes they are, and we have to use that stupidity.
So thank you very much. First and foremost, I absolutely agree that it's tremendously important to raise the awareness in the United States on every single level. And when it comes to go on the offensive, that's exactly the cornerstone of my research that I didn't discuss here. The best defense is offense in the information space. So you should actually launch offensive influence operations. So Russia spends time, energy, and resources defending itself instead of attacking us. Do we have to spread lies? We don't. Let me give you a couple of examples. Russia has been trying for a long time to show that NATO is a paper tiger. But Russia also has its own version of what I like to call mini NATO, CSTO, which is falling apart. Why not to establish influence operations in the global south with Russian allies to remind them that nobody likes a loser? Putin didn't help his ally Armenia with its war with Azerbaijan. So that could be like one example. The truth is on our side, and we do not have to spread lies. But I'll tell you also the ugly truth why. Oftentimes my research, I ask myself whether it's a waste of time. Because in every capital, risk aversion is rewarded. And also here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., to launch offensive influence operations, you have to have leadership in different agencies that are willing to risk to launch such offensive influence operations. That's the part where I really don't know how we can fix it, but I'll tell you one thing. We do have knowledge. We have the truth on our side. We do have capabilities. We have technical capabilities, and we have people on the ground. There is no excuse why we should not do it. And the ugly truth, Russia already believes that we are doing that. So if they already believe that we are doing that, why not just do it?
I'd like to add and to answer partially, to support the answer to this question. So first on the limits of the offensive, as Ivana said, what the explanation that I've heard to our calls in Europe, like, let's do the same, let's be bold as unpredictable as Russians. We can give you this kind of toolbox. You could be taught how to do it. And one of the answers I received, that we can't do it. It's not ethical. So there are some ethical limits for our actions. So this is something that you in Europe have to work on. Mm-hmm. And then I said to this, and probably this could be partial solution, I said, then use Ukrainians for that. Do it with Ukrainians together, because we are not limited by this type of moral considerations, because Russians showed no moral limits to that. So we have natural right to retaliate. And what's important on bringing in this society in America, and this is something where I, as negotiator, see a potential to work with the current administration too, judging from the emphasis that the president made about why he is keen to stop this war as soon as possible, because he wants to stop these brutal hostilities. He's caring about human lives, and this is why Ukrainian side mentioned and raised the issue of illegally detained persons, prisoners of war exchange, deported children. And this is something that has resonated much with him. And on our meetings here these days, we also keep hearing this string. So this is why it's very important that you have it tomorrow, all these panels. And this is where I do believe that we can have a common denominator with all the actors inside America, and we're ready to support you in supplying all this kind of evidence which is needed to support this advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you.